Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at CFN, and we have a very important show today. This is an important day for the whole church, as even though the pontificate of Pope Leo XIV officially began at his election, we are seeing today a symbolic beginning of the ministry of the Roman pontiff with what is known as his inauguration. Now, that word is something relatively new in the history of the church, if we look back, at least in the context of the past 1,000 years or so of the church, as this event used to be known as a coronation, where the Pope would receive the Papal Tiara. It was usually a three-tiered crown. In past centuries, it was only a one or two-tiered crown. But that triple-tiered crown was a representation of him receiving his powers of jurisdiction, magisterium, and his temporal authority. Ever since Pope Paul VI, the popes have wanted to do away with the papal tiara. John Paul II's reasoning was that they wanted to get away from showing that the Pope had a temporal power owning the papal states that they simply no longer had. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. There was some expectation that Pope Leo XIV might bring that back. We can talk about how to temper those expectations in this pontificate and why exactly he didn't. But the main point of this show is going to be looking at his inaugural address. This was a very important moment, as we must think that when it comes to where the eyes are going to be looking at, I think looking at the opening address that Pope Leo XIV had when he first stepped out, showed himself to the entire world, that was an important moment. We've had all these different addresses. We've covered a few of them already, but this one must be one that Pope Leo XIV knew people were going to be looking at. This is going to be setting the tone. This must be carefully crafted. And there are some things in here that I think can really give us an insight as to who this man is, and also give us an insight as to where the church is at. And the title of this episode is going to be titled something like, Is Pope Leo XIV a Vatican II man? And the reason why I bring that up is because there's some important issues in this statement that really need consideration thoroughly. And I think to begin that, we need to look at some history. Something that we'll be talking about are really three different points, and all of them come up in this initial address, which were the main points of the Second Vatican Council. They are the main points of contention of the Second Vatican Council, and that is ecumenism, collegiality, and religious liberty. Religious liberty is the one that really stands out when it comes to Pope Leo's inaugural address. We're going to be talking about that a lot while we look at it. But some history on that, and some history as to how we got to the point, how we got to the environment that we're currently in, and that Pope Leo XIV is going to have to maneuver in. Looking back, really since the French Revolution, we've seen the church have to really deal with a difficult issue of deciding whether or not to promote a reactionary, restorationist policy where the church would actively try to see a restoration of Christian order back to what we saw before even the Protestant revolt, a restoration of the monarchy, for example, the Bourbon dynasty in France, of Catholic states. With liberalism, all those things started to go away. And eventually, especially in the 19th century, and mainly focusing on France, but in other places too, the church decided to go with a more a policy of reconciliation towards the liberal authorities as these liberal revolutions proved successful. And ironically, it was Leo the 13th, who was making a lot of these dealings with the Republican government in France, trying to reconcile the church with these liberal authorities, while also remaining very orthodox in regards to anti-liberalism, and showing that all authority comes from God. Points about natural rights, as well, looking at duties corresponding to rights. All of that was the case really until World War I, where what we saw with the First World War is almost all of Christendom was completely dismantled. You had the Holy Roman Empire, which saw itself with the Habsburg monarchy. It was completely collapsed. You had no more Austro-Hungarian Empire. You had very few monarchies that meant anything in Europe at the time, and you saw alternatives come up. And of course, this led us to the Second World War. But even before that, you saw movements that were very reactionary. Groups like Action Française, which were groups that wanted to really make the country of France back to its Catholic roots. But it had some mixed origins. You had founders and you had leading members that weren't even Catholic, but were using Catholicism as a tool for restoring this reactionary government. And the church really shunned that. Pope Pius XI shunned that. There was also a conflict with the Cristero War, really abandoning the Cristeros in their time of need. That was the Christian, the Catholic defense against many of the revolutionaries in Mexico. And we saw a really new orientation for Catholicism, even beginning back then. That's before the Second Vatican Council. For more history on that, we have lectures from Chris Ferrara on the Cristero War, but also Dr. John Rao recently gave a lecture on this broader history. But moving into the Second Vatican Council after the Second World War, those two things really cannot be disconnected from one another. We saw so much violence, we saw so much extermination and extreme terror happen during the Second World War, that I think many of the people during that time were very hopeful of this new world they were living in, which was a world that was divided really between the first, second, and third worlds. Those were the communist states in the second world, the democratic and liberal states in the first. And the church was faced with a clear choice. And people can point out various figures, but what we saw strictly happen, what we saw in history happen, is that the church thought, going along with this path of reconciling with the liberal governments, they saw a path forward for really promoting the liberal West over over promoting what it used to, the strict reactionary, the strict restorationist movements that the encyclicals, that the earlier popes would seem to imply, that that's the kind of movement we wanted. The popes took a more and the bishops of the world at the time were leaning towards reconciling with the liberal world after the Second World War. And this led ultimately to the Second Vatican Council. When it comes to some of the movers and shakers, you also have, of course, this is somewhat of an oversimplification. You had the Nouvelle Theologie, new theological and philosophical schools. You had the liturgical movement. All this coincided right after the Second World War, in moving into the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council. And the way that the churchmen at the time saw that they could reconcile with the liberal West at the time to help Catholicism grow and receive liberty where it was suppressed in communist countries are these 3 points of collegiality, religious liberty, and ecumenism. So collegiality, that's at least on paper, a sort of decentralizing the church, trying to and there's controversy as to what exactly this means, as there is with all 3 of those points. Giving more power to the bishops. There's a question as to whether or not the bishops receive jurisdiction, the power of legal action by their very consecration, or whether or not that comes from the Pope, whether or not they act as a supreme authority as a college with the Pope, or it's just the Pope himself. Those are questions raised with this topic of collegiality. There's a lot of debate about that. Ecumenism is this desire to dialogue, to speak with, and in certain instances to pray with other religions. That's something that used to be condemned by the church. But moving with ecumenism, there is that desire as well. There were questions that sort of got fuzzy in regards to what is the Catholic Church? Is the Church of Christ the same as the Catholic Church? All these things were questions that were raised by the Second Vatican Council. And finally, and really what we see most prominently in this opening address, there was something known as religious liberty. which Dignitatis Humanae, which was the main document that focused that the Second Vatican Council used to focus on this topic, where it again it's very ambiguous, but fundamentally it says that man has a right to religious liberty, so the positive worship of God in his religion of choosing by his very nature, which is something that was again something that was condemned in previous years, most prominently in something called the Syllabus of Errors, Quanta Cura, that's by Pius IX. And so we have a crisis of doctrine there, but fundamentally that past history is what is motivating this. How can the church reconcile with the liberal world to better promote the gospel? And this is what at least the most charitable viewing of it could be. How can the church receive better liberty to better spread the gospel by reconciling with the liberal West? And the results have been extremely mixed, to say it lightly. In one sense, you saw communist countries collapse, but you certainly have not seen a flourishing of the Catholic faith. At least I wouldn't say so. You might say we've seen a growth of it on the peripheries, but certainly not when it comes to the faithful practice and a growth in real spirituality. Rather, I think the errors of liberalism have spread throughout the world, which even Leo XIV it recognizes. These errors have spread throughout the world regarding materialism, regarding even when it comes to when people do take their spiritual lives seriously. You see modernism being practiced. You see an unorthodox reading um, of various theological issues. All these things are major issues. You see workers being persecuted, suppressed when it comes to their own rights throughout the world. You've seen many of the issues that even were around 100, 200 years ago, they've gotten much worse due to the problem of technology. Liberalism has not proved to be a panacea for the problems of the world, or certainly the problems of the church. And that's where the current pontiff is. And we're going to be talking about some of the history regarding those questions of religious liberty. I'm going to give some book recommendations later, but I want to jump right in now with that history, which I think is very necessary in order to get any sort of understanding of what Pope Leo XIV is talking about, or some of these problematic statements that are in this statement that need to be addressed and that need to be open to a wider conversation. If we're going into this haphazardly and just reading things with no prior understanding, we're going to end up in a hole, and we're going to end up with no knowledge, and ultimately that's not fruitful. That's not what we want to do. So I hope the audience understands why that historical precedent is necessary to understand. Moving in, and even that was a brief review, but this is the document. I'm thankful to the Vatican for sending to the press these translations very quickly. Practically every language was given here. And so this is a relatively short statement here, but I think it's a very, very important one nonetheless. So he says, "Dear brother cardinals, brother bishops and priests, distinguished authorities and members of the diplomatic corps, brothers and sisters, I greet you with a heart full of gratitude at the beginning of the ministry that has been entrusted to me." St. Augustine wrote, quote, "Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." It's from Confessions, one of my favorite books. It's always good to see popes quoting St. Augustine, and it's to be expected that former Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, being an Augustinian himself, is quoting St. Augustine there, and that's one of the greatest quotes that he's ever made, that St. Augustine ever expressed in that wonderful work, Confessions. Moving on, he says, the Pope does, "In these days, we have experienced intense emotions. The death of Pope Francis filled our hearts with sadness. In those difficult hours, we felt like crowds that the gospel says were like sheep without a shepherd." Pausing there, there's something very important to discuss, which is that when it comes to what Leo said later, connected with this event, is that he had a sense that Pope Francis was looking down on him from heaven. He used that word, from heaven. So that's something we critiqued Cardinal Ray for saying during the conclave. He seemed to canonize Francis. And that is something I have an issue with. I don't think we should be one, I think it's uncharitable to the faithful departed because we should, unless somebody displays a heroic sanctity that would show them to be a saint, which I do not think Pope Francis demonstrated, public miracles, for example. In that case, unless we're in a case like that, I do not think we should canonize people saying they're looking down on us from heaven. That can lead to a Protestant mindset where I think realistically people are going to go to purgatory. Now, is it impossible that Pope Francis is in heaven? Is this a theological error that Pope Leo is making? No, it's not a theological error. And those who are making that out to be the case, it's simply not true. The vicar of Christ can avail himself of the means of the church, and those means can be indulgences. For example, it's very possible that Pope Francis received the last rites, died in good dispositions, and made a complete detachment from sin, and was able to receive a plenary indulgence that completely that allowed him to see the beatific vision with no time in purgatory. That's something that is very possible, but it's not something certain. And I don't like when those kinds of things are stated. But Pope Leo did say that. We can make of that what we wish. To me, I see that as something that's somewhat political. I think in order for Pope Leo to really get anything done in his mindset, and frequent listeners of this show will know that I don't think Pope Leo XIV is a hardcore traditionalist who has read the works of Archbishop Lefebvre and is coming into this wanting to restore the Latin Mass as the exclusive Roman rite. I don't think that's what's happening, but I do see him as someone who is genuinely trying to build bridges between the more conservative and more liberal factions, wants there to be peace in the church, which we'll get to in a second, and wants to make some conservative reforms that he can while not upsetting the liberals to cause a schism. That's what I think he's doing. One might disagree with his approach, but that's what I think is happening. There's no reason to make Pope Leo out to be something that he's not, whether that be a liberal monster or a conservative or some kind of traditionalist reactionary that we would like to see, for example. That's not who he is. We must be sober in our interpretations of who Pope Leo XIV actually is. Moving on, though, he says, "Yet on Easter Sunday, we received his final blessing in light of the resurrection." Speaking of Pope Francis, "and in light of the resurrection, we experience the days that followed in the certainty that the Lord never abandons his people, but gathers them when they are scattered and guards them as, quote, a shepherd guards his flock." That's from Jeremiah. In this spirit of faith, the College of Cardinals met for the conclave. Coming from different backgrounds and experiences, we placed in God's hands our desire to elect the new successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome, a shepherd capable of preserving the rich heritage of the Christian faith and at the same time looking to the future in order to confront the questions, concerns, and challenges of today's world. Accompanied by your prayers, we could feel the workings of the Holy Spirit, who is able to bring us into harmony, like musical instruments, so that our heartstrings could vibrate in a single melody. I like that. That's a beautiful analogy he is making there. It's a beautiful image. "I was chosen," he goes on to say, "without any merit of my own, and now with fear and trembling, I come to you as a brother who desires to be the servant of your faith and your joy, walking with you on the path of God's love, for he wants us to be all united in one family. Love and unity. These are two dimensions of the mission entrusted to Peter by Jesus." Pausing, he's emphasizing this notion of the brother, coming to the other bishops as a brother, in a different way that Pope Francis would have made. And the reason I say that is because there was a clear deal made, whether it was an explicit deal or an implicit deal that the conservatives and liberals just came to an understanding. The conservatives expressed a concern before the conclave about the Pope using synodality as a way to concentrate power completely in his own person, and then selecting a few lay people as a symbol of decentralizing the church, but really just to express his own will through an iron fist. Again, One can say that we should have a strong pope, a strong papal office, and a pope who knowing that all of the authority rests in him comes down with a heavy fist on the liberals. But the fact of the matter is that that fist was used on the traditionalists and the conservatives, even the conservatives, which in past years in Benedict's papacy, for example, would never that fist was never used against the conservatives. But it was all ever since the Second Vatican Council, the traditionalists have always received that heavy-handedness. But it was especially done during Pope Francis. And the conservative cardinals, the more conservative cardinals, were concerned at this, like it or not. And they wanted to see a decentralized papacy in a true way, where the Pope was genuinely consulting with the other bishops, trying to understand what was going on a local diocese level, and then letting the bishop make his own decisions based on what is good in his own diocese. And that principle, I think, is a true one. And it's one that prudently might need to be made, as long as we're not compromising doctrine or in saying things like the Pope is a first among equals, for example. As long as we maintain the papal prerogatives, which Pope Leo XIV simultaneously seems to emphasize, even during this event when he really didn't have to. And this is something Pope Francis never did. Pope Leo, when he met with his brother, for example, chose to wear that red mozzetta again, which is something Pope Benedict was known to do. Again, that's a symbol of the papal office. He hasn't been wearing any red shoes, for example, nor did he choose to use the papal tiara. And I think pausing, this might be a good time to bring this up. Some people were expecting that Pope Leo XIV would use the papal tiara, that he bring back those red shoes. I would advise the listeners to consider something, which is that each pope, when he comes in, there's so much going on for the individual pontiff. And the fact is the Pope does have to correspond with the precedent that is set just before him, but also the current constitutions. It would have been nearly impossible and very difficult for the Pope in a timely manner to bring back the papal tiara in a papal coronation, because the present constitutions call for an inauguration. There simply is no place for the tiara in such a case. You can also look to something like Pope Francis during his inauguration. He had to sit in this velvet throne, which he obviously hated, and that was due to Pope Benedict's papacy. That's something Pope Francis would not have called for on his own, but he's simply going on the constitutions and the prior precedent, and so he's forced to go with those traditions of the man who comes before him. What we can look at, though, is what Pope Leo avails himself of in the moment for what he actually has access to. And each time he's been given that, he seems to go with the more traditional options. He wears the red mozzetta when he can. When he was given an option to, he chose to use the most papal gear possible, using that red mozzetta. And I don't think anybody really should have expected him to bring back the papal tiara, seeing how Benedict XVI is the one who took it out of his coat of arms. Also what I mentioned earlier, there simply was no room for a coronation in the present constitutions. If we're going to see a revival of it, I think it would be using the papal tiara in a later day, after maybe some opposition from liberals, and he has to force himself into it, becomes more traditional, and maybe he brings back the papal tiara in a later at a later date, in a later formal ceremony, and maybe he changes the constitutions. That's the most we're going to see from that. That wasn't a surprise, but I'm saying all of this here to emphasize that Pope Leo XIV does still seem to have a knowledge of the duty that's been imparted to him as being the successor of Peter, and how that is something very special. And I don't expect him to do away with that, while even though he has this clear mandate to decentralize the papacy and have a more calm papacy that isn't involved in each individual bishop's diocese. So moving on, though, after that relatively large tangent that I still think is very necessary, gives us a great deal of context, we should move on. He says, we see in today's gospel, which takes us to the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus began the mission he received from the Father to be a fisher of humanity in order to draw it up from the waters of evil and death. Walking along the shore, he had called Peter and the other first disciples to be, like him, fishers of men. Now, after the resurrection, it is up to them to carry on this mission, to cast their nets again and again, to bring the hope of the gospel into the waters of the world, to sail the seas of life so that all may experience God's embrace. That's very important. In my own reading of this and really struggling through this document, trying to understand, which we'll get to, some of the more complicated portions. I think something that is very unique about Pope Leo compared to Pope Francis is that he does see the gospel as being something necessary for people. It's not something that is the most truthful way. He seems to see the gospel as being necessary for, as he says here, the experience of God's embrace. I hope in future documents he clears up the mess that Pope Francis brought up and actually tells us what exactly that means. If the gospel means reception into God's church so that we may receive the forgiveness of sins, so that we may receive salvation. I hope that's what it is, and this seems to imply that, but that needs clarity, especially in light of the Pope Francis pontificate that muddied the waters, saying at the same time Christ is the only way, but also saying all religions lead to God. That this is a problem. One needs to we need to be very precise in our language, but he's leading us towards a more precise vision here. He goes on even further about the gospel. He says, how can Peter carry out this task? And notice he sees Peter's role as being a clear part of salvation, of receiving the gospel. Pope Leo goes on, the gospel tells us that it is possible only because his own life was touched by the infinite and unconditional love of God, even in the hour of his failure and denial. Some may have an issue with the term unconditional love. There is a sense that, that's probably beyond the scope of this episode, but there is a sense in which God's love is unconditional, but there's also a sense in which it is conditional, as one must respond to God's love. We set ourselves outside of God's love through our own actions. And when we also say an infinite love of God, that does not imply that we cannot ourselves reject God's infinite love. But those in devotional language, I've seen both of those phrases used, infinite and unconditional love, in devotional language. For precise doctrinal language, it gets a bit more fuzzy. Maybe we can touch on that in a future episode. He goes on, for this reason, when Jesus addresses Peter, the gospel uses the Greek word agapeo, which refers to the love that God has for us, to the offering of himself, which without reserve and without calculation, whereas the verb used in Peter's response describes the love of friendship that we have for one another. Very good. I love this scriptural analysis he does. He seems to be much more acquainted with that, with scripture scholarship and even textual criticism than Francis was. And that's encouraging. That's something necessary. We've seen so many people convert through the works of men like Scott Hahn and Brant Petrie. If we had a pope promoting that similar thing, as he seems to be leaning in the direction of doing, I think that would be very positive. He goes on, though. Consequently, when Jesus asks Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He is referring to the love of the Father. It is as if Jesus said to him, only if you have known and experienced this love of God, which never fails, will you be able to feed my lambs. Only in the love of God the Father will you be able to love your brothers and sisters with that same more. That is, by offering your life for your brothers and sisters. Peter is thus entrusted with the task of loving more and giving his, he is tasked with the, of loving more and giving his life for the flock. The ministry of Peter is distinguished precisely by the self-sacrificing love, because the Church of Rome presides in charity, and its true authority is the charity of Christ. That's true by analogy. And here's the problem that there's going to be a lot of traditionalists talk about, I'm sure. He says, it is never a question of capturing others by force, by religious propaganda, or by means of power. Instead, it is always and only question of loving as Jesus did. So That's something that is, when speaking of religious propaganda, capturing others by force or power, um, and we're going to read on to get some better context about this. But that's certainly words that we would recognize in somebody like Pope Francis, and wouldn't have a completely true understanding, I think, taken just as they are. They need to be distinguished. Speaking of religious propaganda, for example, and we'll talk about later Pope Leo's use of the word indoctrination. I think what Pope Leo is thinking of is an unreasonable acceptance of authority with no reason at all, or with no use of the intellect. Something akin to 1984, or a communist giving of certain statements that you must accept without consideration. I think that's what's in his mind. Also, capturing others by force. Again, we'll get into this. The when it comes to capturing others by force, the church has said that certain use of persuasion, or even coercion in some cases, when not a forcing other people to convert, but of restraining others to commit certain acts of heresy, of blasphemy, the church permits that. Uh, you can even see that in its giving of the death penalty to heretics, public heretics, in past ages. So uh, you would run into problems when it comes to past teaching, and there's a lot of history with that even Pope Leo gets into in this document. So I think reading on, and then we can get to some of the history. He says, the Apostle Peter himself tells us that Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, and has become the cornerstone. Moreover, if the rock is Christ, Peter must shepherd the flock without ever yielding to the temptation to be an autocrat, lording it over those entrusted to him. On the contrary, he is called to serve the faith of his brothers and sisters, and to walk alongside them, for all of us are living stones, called through our baptism to build God's house in fraternal communion, in harmony of the Spirit, in the coexistence of diversity. If taken in the sense of uh, the sanctification of all, that, or the universal call of holiness to holiness, that would be a true statement. Just because somebody is a layperson doesn't mean they have a less of a duty to live a Christian life, to live a life of holiness. There is a sense, though, in which, of course, the hierarchy of the church has more of a duty to spread the gospel based on their office that they receive, which I think Pope Leo understands there. There's nothing there that goes necessarily contrary to magisterial teaching there. It could be misunderstood, though, in those words, or saying that, for example, Peter's ministry isn't different than the bishop's ministry, which I don't think he's saying there, but they certainly have a common universal call to holiness. That certainly is true. In the words of St. Augustine, the church consists of all those who are in harmony with their brothers and sisters and who love their neighbor. Brothers and sisters, I would like that our first great desire be for a united church, a sign of unity and communion, which becomes a leaven for a reconciled world. And continuing, because that's very important as well. But again, he's always spoken about being a bridge builder, which has a very precise meaning. Getting through this paragraph, we can understand it. He says, in this our time, we still see too much discord, too many wounds caused by hatred, violence, prejudice, the fear of difference, like celebrating the Latin Mass. That's my own reading of it. Certainly, we've seen a fear of difference when it regards to traditional Catholics being able to celebrate the Mass. He goes on, though, in an economic paradigm that exploits the earth's resources and marginalizes the poorest. Certainly, I think some people, this is me speaking, will see that phrase, an economic paradigm that exploits the earth's resources and marginalizes the poorest. They'll say that this woke Pope is at it again. Well, I don't think so. I think there is a real critique of, um, especially looking in poor regions of the world, making it basically impossible for people to grow in economic prosperity due to exploitation of the earth's resources, making the environment basically unlivable to live in, forcing the person to either migrate, causing a migration crisis, or to live in poverty with a low paying job just forever for all of your generations. That's obviously a problem. Just because it doesn't correspond with libertarian economics doesn't really matter. I think there is a moral problem that economic issues get into. When you deal with economic exploitation of the poor and of the earth's resources, there's necessarily a moral component there that the church has to involve itself in. And that's something that Pope Leo XIII, going back, over 100 years ago now, that's something he dealt with very specifically in Rerum Novarum, which Pope Leo XIV quotes from quite extensively, actually. But going on, he says, for our part, we want to be a small leaven of unity, communion, and fraternity within the world. We want to say to the world with humility and joy, look to Christ, come closer to him, welcome his word that enlightens and consoles, listen to his offer of love, and becomes his one family. In one Christ, we are one. That's important for this next phrase. This is the path to follow together among ourselves, but also with our sister churches, with those who follow other religious paths, with those who are searching for God, with all women and men of goodwill, in order to build a new world where peace reigns. So, that could be seen in a way of religious indifferentism, but I don't think it is, actually, especially when we read it in its context. There are certain things I have problems with. I think we should go with this one by one. First is his preface that he makes. Notice what he's saying. This unity that we're united in is in, which is he's saying it's in Christ. In Christ we are one. Look to Christ. So if we see that there is a necessity for everyone to be in Christ, united in Christ, in a real way of joining and uniting oneself to the Catholic Church with the precepts of the Church and with the moral law, then that's absolutely true for all of these groups. He says our sister Christian churches. I do not like that phrase. One could say he's speaking of the sister Catholic churches, and he is speaking as head specifically of the Roman Church. We would, for example, say that there is a sense in which there are particular churches within the Catholic Church, like the Ruthenian Church, the Melkite Church, the Russian Catholic Church. All of those are specific sister Christian churches. He doesn't mean that, I don't think, and I think that's a problem. He's meaning this, I think, in the sense of the other patriarchs that were there present, who were at this inauguration. I believe it's certain, actually. I think that Patriarch Bartholomew was there, head of the Greek Orthodox. There were representatives from the Coptic Miaphysite Orthodox as well. That's who he's speaking of, and he's obviously also thinking of, I'm sure, Protestants in an analogous way. But in the post-conciliar time, this goes back to ecumenism. The church has decided to arbitrarily state that certain groups like the Greek Orthodox and the Miaphysite groups are, in some cases, particular churches. And even when it comes to the Eastern Orthodox, they are granted certain prerogatives, like being able to have jurisdiction to hear your confession, for example. Those, and again, when it comes to, are they real churches? Well, no, not from a true Catholic standpoint. They're not in the Catholic Church. These would be schismatic sects, but the church has deemed them particular churches. That's what he's referring to. I think that's dangerous, because those groups are in error. If one denies the filioque, you're going against a defined dogma of the church. It is a sin to do, and we cannot promote sin. And so I don't think we should be, I think sometimes that can be fruitless in such a way. And if it is done in that sort of way, I think there's a double standard with how it's applied to traditional Catholic groups, which is with derision. I think there is a double standard when it comes to just giving complete liberality to the East and these Eastern churches, and also using this sort of language in regards to Protestant churches, when I don't think there is a true sense in which we can call these groups churches. This has not been thought through, frankly. None of the ecumenism that started with the Second Vatican Council has really been thought through to an extent that we have a complete understanding of how all of this works. There is some history there in regards to, there is a scandal in regards to if the Church of Christ is greater than the Catholic Church. This is something that Ratzinger later Pope Benedict XVI tried to deal with in a document that clarified that it wasn't the Catholic Church doesn't just subsist in the Church of Christ doesn't just subsist in the Catholic Church. There is an identity there, but there is still issues in regards to these particular churches. You've seen this two lungs phrase mentioned, that the church breathes with two lungs, that suggests that the Eastern Orthodox is a part of the church. It's very confusing. And so in conclusion, I don't really like that language, sister Christian churches, and the past magisterium certainly has a problem with using the word church for those groups. But he does use it, and that's simply what he does. He also says those who follow other religious paths with those who are searching for God and people of goodwill. So that means non-baptized Christians. There's also an issue with calling heretic groups Christian. In previous years, the Catholic Church refrained from doing that, saying you must be a Catholic in order to be truly considered a Christian. In later years, we've seen Christian come to mean, using an analogy, a baptized person, whether or not they're in the Catholic Church or not. But here he extends that we must have unity with those following other religious paths, searching for God, with all men and women of goodwill. But notice what that unity is in. So this is why I don't think this is as big of a scandal as some people make it out to be. He's saying the unity must be to follow Christ, in one Christ. And so what I think he's actually saying here is that we must, or at least what I think the most charitable interpretation would be, is that we must follow this path of coming closer to Christ, and that mandate also exists for everyone else. Those who are seeking the goodwill, who are not Christian, and those who are baptized Christians, everyone has the same prerogatives to seek the one Christ. I actually think that's fine. But it would need clarification to more clearly connect those two parts, that there is one Christ that we must be united in through the Catholic Church. And all of these men and women of goodwill have a mandate to join the Catholic Church to find that. And he seems to say this explicitly, saying this is the missionary spirit that must animate us, not closing ourselves off in our small groups, nor feeling superior to the world. We are called to offer God's love to everyone in order to achieve that unity. And notice he's saying the unity doesn't exist, which is refreshing, because in past years we've said that there's almost a unity that we need to sort of wake up to. We have a unity that we just don't realize yet. We're all the human family. We just need to recognize that. He seems to be saying that there isn't that unity. That unity must be found, presumably in the Catholic Church, and it has to be offered to everybody. And he says, which does not cancel out differences, but values the personal history of each person and the social and religious culture of every people. Hopefully that would mean just being the Eastern Catholic groups can retain their own traditions, but I also hope that would refer to the traditional Catholic groups. We have our own culture. Why can't we be involved in the unity as well? I don't think, as I mentioned in the last episode, there is an inconsistency to say all of this bit about unity and retaining religious culture and simultaneously say you are not allowed to go to the Latin Mass because that's outdated, even though the church promoted that for centuries. It's a hypocritical sign. If you want to say all of these things about unity, you have to act it out. And that, I think, really starts with the people closest to the Roman Church, which are those in the Roman Church actually pursuing God's faithfulness through the traditional liturgy. This will only have meaning, I will say, this bit about respecting everyone's religious culture, if that is done. If it's not done, those are empty words, I think. And I hope, because again, it could be taken in a way that we're not going to cancel somebody's religious culture in the sense that they're outside the church. We don't want the Eastern Orthodox to become Catholic. That would be a false sense. I tend to think that's not what he means here. I think he wants to see a unity that does not exist already through coming into communion with the Catholic Church, with actually resolving our differences, as we saw with the Council of Florence, where the Eastern Orthodox briefly came back into communion with the Catholic Church after agreeing upon the essential dogmas. That's what I would hope is what he's getting at there. He finishes, brothers and sisters, this is the hour for love. The heart of the gospel is the love of God that makes us brothers and sisters. With my predecessor, Leo XIII, we can ask ourselves today, if this criterion were to prevail in the world, would not every conflict cease and peace return? There's that quote from Rerum Novarum. With the light and strength of the Holy Spirit, let us build a church founded on God's love, a sign of unity, a missionary church that opens its arms to the world, proclaims the word, allows itself to be made restless by history, and becomes a leaven of harmony for humanity. Together as one people, as brothers and sisters, let us walk towards God and love one another. Okay, having finished that, again, there's some bits of ambiguity there that the liberals will be able to exploit, certainly, especially in regards to the message here in this paragraph, speaking of following that one path together. They will ignore this bit about uniting ourselves in Christ, which is what makes a lot of these efforts fruitless, because any sign to have real religious conversations with those outside of the Catholic Church will always be undermined by ecumenists who seek to diminish the differences and just discover our unity we have as the human person. But more problematic, I think, is this phrase up there. It is never a question of capturing others by force, by religious propaganda, or by means of power. Now, Pope Leo XIV also had stated this similarly in another previous document, a previous address, in a very similar way, I should say. This is a document he had, or excuse me, an address he made to the members of the diplomatic corps who were also at his inaugural address. And he speaks of religious liberty. He says, going down here, I think this is one of the most, the clearer moments he says this. He says, I believe that religions and interreligious dialogue can make a fundamental contribution to fostering a climate of peace. This naturally requires full respect for religious freedom, liberty, in every country, since religious experience is an essential dimension of the human person. Without it, it is impossible, if not, it is difficult, if not impossible, to bring about the purification of the heart necessary for building peaceful relationships. Now, recall what we talked about at the beginning when it comes to what the impetus was behind this trying to reconcile with the liberal world, to receive a religious liberty for all so that the Catholic Church could have religious liberty to spread the gospel in Eastern communist countries, which was then subsequently undermined by the fact that liberalism is not compatible with Catholicism, and the church doesn't seem to be waking up to that. Well, the reasoning that Pope Leo says here is actually very historical in line of the defenders of religious liberty, contrary to Francis, who had his own unique ideas of basically saying all religions lead to God. That's a quote from Francis. Because he says here, it requires the respect for religious liberty, the climate of peace, and contribution to fostering a climate of peace. So this needs to have some historical background. Where is Pope Leo getting this? So when Dignitatis Humanae, the document that talked about religious liberty from the Second Vatican Council, when that was promulgated, it really immediately had some pushback because it had undermined a previous formulation of a genuine concern that many of the bishops had for something called religious toleration, which was something that, and this was in the preparatory documents as well, where the church was saying it can be a good and even a civil right for the church, for the sake of the common good, to not disrupt the common good, to grant toleration, recognizing that there is an evil, but allowing public worship of false religions in some case for the sake of the common good. And that this is a toleration granted on a case-by-case basis. That was thrown out. All those preparatory documents were just dismantled and thrown out. And immediately there were these quickly thrown together documents like Dignitatis Humanae that were rushed through and brought to the forefront. A good book on that is from Roberto de Mattei, the Second Vatican Council. That's the greatest history of the Second Vatican Council that has been written. But immediately there were also concerns about what this new document was actually saying. And at the forefront of that was a man named Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Many of our audience will know that he is the head of the Society of St. Pius X, the leading traditionalist faction, in many ways the vanguard of the Catholic Church. And he wrote a number of things against religious liberty, which culminated in the 1980s, where Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, asked Archbishop Lefebvre to put his concerns down in a letter and list all of them. And that resulted in this book, which was called originally the Dubia, which is just a question, a doubt. And it later is printed as a book. This one is translated by Father Pizzot, published by Angelus Press, called Religious Liberty Questioned. Quite long, actually, with both appendixes at the back. It ends up being 146 pages. Very long, considering that this is something that was submitted to the Vatican. And in it, he lists many concerns. There are many different doubts. Over 50, I think he actually lists doubt by doubt. And he begins with a demonstration of the Catholic teaching, saying that there is a difference between what is known as a subjective and an objective right in terms of religious liberty. A subjective right is your right in general to worship God. That's something that corresponds to the duty you have as a human person to worship God. That's something, just by existing, a part of the natural law, you have a duty to do. But especially the precepts of the church demand this, but a right that you have is to meet that duty to worship God. That's a subjective right. It's rooted in the subject, in the person. The objective right is the particular worship that you make of God. Now, that objective right, this particular worship, that particular religion, that's going to be acceptable based on how it conforms to the objective moral order of things. So, for example, what Archbishop Lefebvre would point out, drawing from Pope Pius XII, drawing from the preconciliar teaching, which in many cases is infallible, it's irreformable, especially regarding these fundamental issues. But if you have, for example, you desire to worship God in a general sense, but objectively, in this particular case, you choose to do that through a superstitious religion like paganism or like Hinduism or Islam, you no longer have an inalienable right. Your subjective right to worship God generally is inalienable. That cannot be you cannot be prevented from doing that, from having that right, that duty, by the state. But when it comes to the particular case of I'm worshiping God in this religion, that religion, that is alienable because it can undermine the objective moral order that your duty is serving, which is Jesus Christ. And so if I wanted to worship God in a false religion like Islam that is blaspheming Jesus Christ, well, in that case, I lose my objective right. I still have the duty to worship God, but I don't have the right to do it in that particular false religion. So Archbishop, that's what underlies all of this. He bases this much on the document Quanta Cura, which is to many people seen as one of the ex cathedra statements of the Roman Pontiff, infallible in some of its propositions, and also the Syllabus of Errors, which other people say is an infallible declaration in certain propositions. And he bases it on this. He sends it to Ratzinger. Ratzinger then constructs a response the response to the Dubia. And Ratzinger got overwhelmed by this document. He didn't really know what to make of it. He didn't know how to respond to it because it was so long. And so what Ratzinger does instead is to really construct his own vision for why he sees religious liberty as being legitimate. And Ratzinger says that each man has a right to freely choose God. He must freely choose God because God wants us to make a free act of love, because the act of worship, the act of love, does not mean anything if it's not free, if it's not given of our own volition, of our own will, because it requires our own consent and will, or it's fruitless. And so what he says is that in order for that to be protected, in order for that to not be diminished and to not be forced, thus losing its importance and its dignity, man having that right has to be unrestrained from publicly worshiping in the religion of his choosing. And he says that that's rooted in the freedom of man's will. And if you were to obstruct him from worshiping in Islam or Protestantism, ultimately that would be diminishing his free will. So that's what Ratzinger says. And what Archbishop Lefebvre was somewhat scandalized because I should also mention this. Pope Benedict says that the one concession he made was that freedom of the will to worship God in a false religion had certain restraints on it if it violated the common good, the public order. So the state could come in and say you can't worship in that that religion because that's attacking the public order. And he says within due limits, and then he just doesn't define it. And he says that this change, based on how this is different from the syllabus of errors in Quanta Cura, is that there has been a development, there's been a change in tradition. That scandalized Archbishop Lefebvre. He saw that as being saying that church teaching could change like that rather than just merely develop. He saw that as almost a demonstration of modernism. And he did not see that. He saw that as basically granting to be a complete explanation of the problem that he listed of the difference between objective and subjective rights. So really what we're seeing, and that eventually led to Archbishop Lefebvre and Cardinal Ratzinger stop talking to one another. There was nothing else to be said. Cardinal Ratzinger was convinced he had answered Archbishop Lefebvre's questions. Archbishop Lefebvre was under the impression Cardinal Ratzinger basically expressed his concerns. And so we just ended up with the deadlock there. Now, what Pope Leo is saying here in this statement, if we see here, I think we can see that basically what Pope Leo XIV is saying here is the same thing that Ratzinger was stated. And so we're left with the same problem that we had in the 1980s, of this unresolved question of religious liberty. We don't know what the due limits on the freedom of man's will. We don't know what the true interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae is. It's all a matter, it's up to theologians to just figure this out. And meanwhile, we have liberalism running amok, and the rights of the Catholic Church are being diminished. And so that can, I think, give us an explanation for what Pope Leo is saying here. He is still in the Ratzingerian vein. He's not a traditional Catholic in that sense. But that can give us an understanding. That the ideas of Archbishop Lefebvre were later very well expanded upon by Michael Davies in the 90s with one of the best books on the topic, which is called The Second Vatican Council and Religious Liberty. This is published by Angelus Press. We're not sponsored by them, but this is still a great book. The other one, Religious Liberty Questioned, is also by Angelus Press. And Michael Davies goes into how we could basically get out of the crisis with this deadlock by the church basically saying the higher weighted magisterial teaching is on the side of what the traditional Catholics are saying. And we have to just move away from the ambiguous expressions of the Second Vatican Council, because the Second Vatican Council did not express them or intend to express them infallibly. And there are certain preconciliar documents that did express these things in an infallible manner, in an irreformable manner. And the Second Vatican Council simply cannot be taken in continuity with them, as we've seen with this just endless debate on this. So I mention all of that to say that it is clear to me that Pope Leo XIV is a Vatican II man in the Ratzingerian vein. Again, these are big words we're saying, but important distinctive words, which is that Pope Leo is following in the tradition of Ratzinger, but ultimately these things are unresolved. Anyone saying that these things are set in stone, what is the extent of religious dialogue? What is the extent of religious toleration or religious liberty? They're deceiving you, because the reality is that these are debates that have been shut off really in the past 25 years because people are scared to have a true meaningful dialogue on these issues, religious liberty, ecumenism. There's just been a gridlock. And so what I suggest could be done is a meaningful conversation about which documents have a higher magisterial weight, the ones of the Second Vatican Council or the preconciliar teaching, which goes back a long time. That's a good start. Giving the Society of St. Pius X and traditional Catholics an equal playing field to actually have these conversations and reach meaningful conclusions. Because I think ultimately the issues that Pope Leo is talking about, uh, this loss of meaning in the secular world, this materialism, which is directly promoted by liberalism, all of these are caused by the church not really having a true understanding of how to deal with the modern world. And the only way that we're going to come to a better understanding of how to deal with the modern world is by actually engaging with the critiques of liberalism that the reactionaries, the restorationists made, and then the critics of the Second Vatican Council made. And then at the same time, on the traditionalist end, actually getting into some of these problems of how can we in the real world solve the problem of there being in cultures and in societies no Catholic states anymore, and no real majority Catholic countries. How can we not upset the public order but still spread the gospel and grow? And I think that would result to going to those preconciliar documents and saying, well, maybe there is some room for toleration, for some expression of religious toleration as a civic right, as Archbishop Lefebvre says, what we might do to take a interreligious dialogue in a true sense of actually saying, okay, Eastern Orthodox, let's find where we disagree and have these debates, rather than just saying we're all equal, we're all in this together. And then finally to come to a real solution in dealing with these economic and social problems of our time, expressed in the wars we see around the world and the exploitation on an economic level. All of those things require a great deal that Pope Leo is going to have to deal with. But on the lay level, I think it's important that we understand the debate that is surrounding it and not seeing this in isolation and just saying, Pope Leo XIV is a Vatican II heretic. We shouldn't listen to him. Cover your ears. Rather, I think we should understand the issues, understand the difficulties that Pope Leo is going to be dealing with, understand where he's coming from, which is not where we're coming from necessarily, but also not where the progressives are coming from or where Pope Francis was coming from. And we need to critique it on that principled level. Because if we're not doing that, and if we're not dealing with this in a spirit of charity and understanding, ultimately what we're doing is fruitless and we'll never make any progress. And I'm sure Archbishop Lefebvre, who was continuously having those conversations with Ratzinger, and I'm sure Ratzinger would say the same thing, I think there is fruitful conversations to be had, but that starts with giving the traditional Catholics a level playing field to actually raise these concerns, so that these priests can express their concerns for their own priestly societies, and for the church at large. And so that concludes our analysis for this opening day. This is a long episode, but I hope the audience can understand why we spend so much time looking at this. A reminder, those books are published by Angelus Press, the Second Vatican Council and Religious Liberty and Religious Liberty Questioned. The other one is Roberto de Mattei's book on the Second Vatican Council. That can give you a great beginning to understanding some of these wider issues. So make sure you continue to pray for Pope Leo XIV, pray for the wider church. Help us out by leaving a like and a comment on this video, sharing this video around. YouTube doesn't like sharing our content. The algorithm isn't always favorable. And on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, leaving us a 5-star review really does help this channel to grow. So from all of us here at Catholic Family News, may God grant you many joyful years.